All right, good morning, Mr. Sims.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Mr. Sims, you, sir, are reminded you are still under oath, and Mr. Scheck, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Good morning, Mr. Sims. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm fine.
We left off yesterday talking about the amounts of DNA in samples found at the Bundy crime scene, some from June 13th, some from one from July 3rd.
Yes.
Now, in terms of RFLP testing, your protocol indicates that you would like to have as much as 150 nanograms to do an RFLP test.
Well, we'd like to have even more than that if we could get it. It makes the turnaround time a lot faster.
But the statement in your protocol is that you're ideally looking for at least 150 nanograms.
No, I believe that misstates the protocol.
You tell me.
Well, what we'd like to have is at least 50, but if we had our druthers, we'd like to put, say, about 400 on the gel.
But it would be a fair statement that 50 nanograms is about as low as you like to go with an RFLP test.
With some of the newer probes, we're even getting down into the 25 nanogram range. Dr. Badoli from the FBI has recently published an article in which one of the newer probes, D5S110, was shown to be as sensitive as, down to 25 nanograms, maybe even 10 nanograms. So the sensitivities have been improved on some of the probes. But yes, ideally we'd like about 50 at minimum.
Well, you recall discussing these issues in August.
Yes, I do.
And in August, did you indicate that 50 nanograms is about as low as we like to go with the RFLP procedures? In other words, the sensitivity is pretty weak below 50 nanograms.
Yes.
Now, would you agree that in a drop of blood, there's about 1,000 nanograms of human DNA?
Yes, the recovery would be, in a drop of blood, would be about 1,000 nanograms, which is about a microgram of DNA, yes.
And in a microliter of DNA, you would expect to find about 20 nanograms.
Microliter
you said-
of DNA.
A microliter of blood, my apologies.
In a microliter of blood, yes, it would be about 20 nanograms.
And a microliter of blood would produce a spot about the size of a pinhead.
Yes.
So these Bundy drops, at best, 52, has the human DNA equivalent to a pinhead's worth of blood.
Objection, that's argumentative. It's vague.
Rephrase the question.
Excuse me.
Assuming that number 52, that is the LAPD item number from which the RFLP was performed.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yes.
Assuming that has on the order of 25 to 30 nanograms of human DNA.
Objection, that's an improper hypothetical, inconsistent with the test.
Sustained.
All right, assuming it has something on the order of 31.5 nanograms of human DNA.
Same objection.
Sustained.
But you would agree that 20 nanograms would come from 1 microliter of blood.
One fresh microliter of blood, not
Fresh.
necessarily a blood stain,
Right, 1 fresh microliter of blood,
right?
and that's the size of a pinhead.
That's right, but now you're talking about a volume of blood as opposed to if you were to spot about I think I mentioned yesterday, if you were to look at a blood stain of about 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, which is about a pinhead, you'd usually recover about 2 nanograms. So it's the recovery is not always the same. I mean, it's one thing to talk about a stain and, excuse me, how much DNA you'd get out of a stain versus if you were to look at the DNA in a volume of liquid blood.
Right.
There is a difference
There
there.
is a difference, and the difference is, has to do with the DNA content of the volume you're dealing with.
Well, no, I'm trying to distinguish between a volume of liquid whole blood
Yes.
and what you can extract out of that versus what you typically would get out of a blood stain on a garment or something like that.
But the point is that to the extent that you put you extract DNA from amount of blood, right?
Yes.
The amount of DNA you can get out of the amount of, the volume of blood is dependent on the number of cells within that volume of blood from which you can extract DNA.
Yes.
And if you have blood with a comparatively high content of DNA per volume, you're going to get a bigger yield.
Yes.
And so if you cross-contaminate a degraded sample with blood that has more DNA, you're going to get a bigger yield from the contaminant that has a greater amount of DNA in that volume of blood.
Can you?
Testimony's compound.
I'm not sure I understand that question.
All right, let's try it again. You have a degraded sample, okay?
Okay.
Well, let's do it this way. There are volumes of blood that have higher DNA content than other volumes of blood.
Yes, we saw that in this case, for example, with the reference samples.
Right. And so if there's a transfer of a volume of blood with a high DNA content onto a sample where the DNA has been degraded to the point where it is not detectable, you with me?
Yes.
You're going to get a yield in terms of nanograms of DNA that might be, for example, higher than you would expect to find on a blood swatch that had been degraded.
Yes, I think I understand. I was following you well until the very end there. Are you saying that if you took a blood volume of liquid from a person that had a high level of DNA and then that got onto the degraded stain, then that would be higher than if you took a person that had a lower level of DNA to begin with and got that onto the stain?
Going back to that whole discussion we had yesterday, remember the charts about some volumes of blood have higher DNA content than others.
Well, I think what you're saying is some people at different times, their bloods are different. For example, you may have more white blood cells than I have. Is that what
No.
you're saying? Okay,
No.
I'm lost.
All right. I'm talking about, you agreed, I think you're saying, that you would expect to find, for example, in a reference tube, in the volume of blood in a reference tube, a higher yield of DNA content from a volume than you would from a stain that had been picked up off a dirty substrate and put in a plastic bag and degraded
Oh, okay.
for
Yes.
7 hours,
Yes,
right?
the answer to that is yes.
Yes, okay. And so when you take blood from samples that have a higher DNA content, right, assume the blood has a higher DNA content, you cross-contaminate it onto something else that has virtually no DNA content or not a detectable DNA content, you're going to get the yield from the volume of blood that has the higher DNA content.
Objection's compound, it's unintelligible.
Do you understand the question, Mr. Sims?
Actually, that one I think I do.
All right, go ahead.
I think the answer to that is yes.
Thank you. Okay. You talked yesterday about substrate controls.
Yes.
And Mr. Harmon asked you a lot of questions about that. Do you recall those?
Yes, I do.
All right. And one purpose you talked about of a substrate control is to swatch a section near a stain in order to see if there is some cellular material near that stain.
Yes, in other words, if there may be some background DNA that may contribute to what you might see in a stain.
Right. But you were suggesting that a substrate control could also serve another purpose in terms of giving us some information about the possibility of cross-contamination in the handling of samples.
Objection is argumentative, what he was suggesting.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Right. Were you asked a series of questions yesterday by Mr. Harmon, and you gave answers indicating that you thought the substrate controls could be looked at to give us some information about the possibility of cross-contamination in the handling of samples.
Well,
Objection. I don't remember what the basis was, Ron. That's misleading. That misstates his testimony of yesterday.
Well, I think it doesn't just give you some information. I think it gives you a great deal of information about how those samples were processed.
All right, and you answered, you were asked questions about, well, I forget how you were asked questions. Let's try it this way. You gave testimony that the substrates controls might give us information about whether or not laboratory criminalists, when they handled the swatches at the crime laboratory, cross-contaminated samples.
Yes.
And that would include the point where the swatches were taken out of, were wet and taken out of the plastic bags with the test tubes.
Yes, and assuming they went through the entire process.
And it would include the portion of the process where the wet swatches were put into the test tubes.
Yes.
And it would include the part of the process where the next morning the swatches were taken out of the test tubes with the pipette.
Yes, assuming they all went through the same process.
And would include that part of the process where the swatches were then folded into the bindles.
Again, the same answer.
All right. Now, looking at that portion of the process, the answers you gave yesterday to the questions were based specifically on the assumption that the substrate controls, I think these were your words, were systematically alternated between the specimen samples and the substrate controls.
I believe that was my understanding.
You used the word
yes.
systematically alternated, correct?
Wait.
I thought he finished.
You walked over his answer. He
I'm
wasn't
sorry.
finished yet. Also, Mr. Sims, take a breath before you start answering his question. All right? Proceed.
Thank you.
Yes, my answer was that my understanding was that they were systematically taken in these steps.
Well, let's put it another way. You were basing your answers on the assumption that the criminalist systematically alternated between handling the specimen, then the substrate control, then the series of specimen swatches, and the substrate control, the series of specimen swatches, the subcase control, etc., right?
Yes.
And the reason that is, and that's a critical assumption to your notion that these substrate controls can give us information about cross-contamination.
Objection, that misstates his testimony, Your Honor.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
All right. The idea of a control giving you information about cross-contamination is that the control must be handled in parallel or in the same way that you handle the specimens.
Objection, that's vague in what context, Your Honor?
Overruled.
Well, the My answer to that would be that whenever you're processing samples, whether it be stain, substrate control, stain, one does look to the order of the processing, because if the inference is that something here cross-contaminated the next one, well, then it doesn't make sense that this one down here was cross-contaminated from something up here.
Right.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, precisely, and that's the reason that you're saying that one might be able to draw conclusions about cross-contamination is because you are assuming that there was systematic alternation in the handling of the specimens. In other words, the substrate controls were handled in parallel in a systematic alternation with the specimens.
Objection, it's vague in terms of what's in parallel and what part of the process we're talking about.
Oh, do you understand the question?
I think I do. I think if you're talking about just the substrate controls, then the alternation is part of that. What I was talking about too, though, was that you're looking at how things are processed and the idea of what could potentially get contaminated down the line.
Yes, but
So that could be stain, too.
But your answers yesterday, you used the word, with respect to the questions, you're assuming that the substrate controls in the specimens were handled with a systematic alternation.
Yes.
Objection,
Now-
Your Honor, that, it's vague in terms of there are different parts of this, Your Honor.
Oh,
Now let's talk.
But we have asked that now.
No,
three
I
times.
want to just make sure this concept clear. Let's talk about, just for an example, a reagent control.
Okay.
The reagent control is the one where you're at the point of extraction in the PCR process,
Yes.
and you're putting into the tubes the different reagents that go into the PCR mix.
Yes.
And so you have one tube, for example, that has the maybe a specimen that has a swatch with blood on it.
Okay.
Is that what happens?
Yes, the only thing I think we mixed up on was when you mentioned the PCR mix. You're actually talking about the extraction now.
All right, yes.
It's an extraction.
I'm talking about the stuff you put into the tube.
Okay. This is now to get the DNA out of the samples.
Yes.
So that's an extraction.
Okay.
Okay.
But the reagent control is that you take a tube without any swatch in it and you put the reagents in it, right?
Yes.
And when you do that, you do it in parallel with all the other specimens,
Well, you're actually doing it in sequence.
in
right?
sequence,
Yes.
right? In other words, you're going to make sure that you're taking the reagents to make up this control from the same batch, same lots, the same time, as you're creating the reagents for the other tubes, right?
Yes.
And that's what gives you some confidence that the control would work, because you're running that reagent control in parallel or handling it in the same way that you're handling all the other specimens.
Yes.
And that's what gives you the information about whether or not there may be some contaminant in the reagents that were used.
Yes.
So it would be of no particular use if you took the reagents from a run you did in the afternoon and then used that and ran that one. That wouldn't tell you about whether you had contamination on a previous run, would it?
Well, I'm not sure I understand that, because are we talking about the same reagents?
Well, that would be the question. Are we talking about this? Let me get it in another way.
Okay.
If the substrate controls here were not handled with systematic alternation, you with me?
As far as the evidence processing now.
As far as the handling of the evidence is concerned, all right?
Yes.
And let's say that a series of specimen swatches were handled in a batch,
Okay.
and maybe a series of control swatches were handled in a batch.
Okay.
That would not be the kind of systematic alternation you were talking about yesterday.
Objection, proper hypothetical misstates the testimony.
Overruled.
In other words, if the substrate controls were processed entirely differently from the swatches themselves, is that what you're saying?
We don't need the word entirely. Let's just say some of them were handled in a batch together, and a series of specimen items were handled in a batch together.
Objection is made together with what?
Overruled.
Does this, I guess what I'm confused on is, do you mean now in the collection process also? Are you talking about just in the laboratory?
Let's just focus, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Let's just focus on handling in the laboratory.
Okay.
And the substrate controls were not handled with systematic alternation as you discussed yesterday.
Okay.
Would that not undermine the value of the substrate controls in terms of giving us any information about cross-contamination in the handling of the specimens?
I think you would have to say you don't have as much information there. That's true.
And in order to make sure that a substrate control is serving as more than just a control about what came from the substrate, but as a control that gives you information about cross-contamination, it would be a good thing if the criminalists involved understood that the substrate control would serve that function.
Not objection, it's irrelevant, beyond the scope of the act.
Overruled.
Yes.
Because you're counting on the criminalists involved to carefully, systematically alternate their handling of the specimen samples and the substrate controls.
Well, no, I'm counting on the criminalist to do everything that the criminalist does in a careful fashion. What you're asking me is, can I make as much inference about how these things were handled retroactively given a particular scenario? I mean, I'm not counting on that as much as I'm counting on them handling it in a careful fashion all the way down.
You're counting on them handling it in a careful fashion and doing systematic alternation. That was the way you answered the questions yesterday.
No, I'm saying if you're going to place that great reliance on the substrate controls, on the negative results from the substrate controls, if you're going to use that as an inference that then these things were processed properly, then that's correct. On the other hand, just because that wasn't done, it doesn't mean they weren't done properly.
Well, you would agree that to do this system, it would be useful to ensure that there really was systematic alternation in the handling of the substrate controls in the specimens if the criminalist performing that operation knew that it was important to systematically alternate.
Yes.
And systematic alternation of the substrate controls as a check on cross-contamination should continue not just in the handling of the samples in the laboratory, but through the process where you extract the DNA.
Yes.
And it should continue in the process of sending substrate controls, of cutting up specimens and substrate controls and sending them to other laboratories.
Objection, that's argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained, goes beyond the scope of work.
Let's try this.
Mr. Scheck.
Oh, that was my mistake. It is Exhibit number 177C, LAPD Evidence Disposition Summary. Now, the Los Angeles Police Department sent you, DOJ, sample 47, the Bundy swatch, on August 12th, 1994.
I believe that's correct, yes.
And they sent you on August 12th, 1994, sample 48, another one, some Bundy swatches, right?
Yes,
And 49 on August 12th, 94, they sent you Bundy swatches, right?
yes,
And on August 12th, they sent you number 50, some Bundy swatches.
yes.
And they actually sent, now, 52 was at Cellmark, right? You didn't get that on August 12th.
That's correct.
But looking at this board, you see these logos where that's the swatch with red, that represents the bloodstain swatches.
Yes,
They didn't send you the substrate controls until September 7th, 1994 for sample 47, 48, 49, or 50.
that's correct.
In fact, Mr. Sims, didn't you call the people at the Los Angeles Police Department and say, send me the substrate controls because substrate controls ought to be handled with systematic alternation with the specimens as a protection against cross-contamination?
I'm sure I didn't use those words, but as I recall, a little bit of history here, this case originally started out as looking like an RFLP case because those swatches from the Bundy crime scene looked like very good bloodstains to work with in their appearance.
Mr. Sims, I don't mean to be impolite to you at all. Forgive me, but I think the answer is not
Motion to strike,
responsive.
Your Honor. I object to the speech, Your Honor.
I would move to strike his answer is not responsive and just let him answer my
Why don't you
question.
answer the question?
My question is, sir, very simple one. Did you ask the Los Angeles Police Department to send you the substrate controls after you had first received the specimen controls without the substrate controls?
I don't know if I asked the LAPD or if I put that request through Lisa Kahn
Lisa Kahn
of the
was
District Attorney's Office.
All right. So in other words, you put the request in to the District Attorney's Office to pass on to the LAPD to ask them to send you the substrate controls.
I may have done that, yes. I don't know if, I may have spoken to LAPD, I can't recall who I contacted.
Point is, sir, you wanted the substrate controls, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And you wanted the substrate controls because when you were performing DNA analysis, you were going to make sure to systematically alternate your handling of the substrate controls and the specimen items.
No, that's not true. The reason I wanted the substrate controls was because this was clearly a PCR issue, and I wanted to make sure that we had negative substrate controls to make the proper interpretations of the bloodstains.
When you got the substrate controls in September, and you went through the rest of the analysis, you would treat the substrate control in parallel with the specimen when performing your DNA analysis.
Well, for most of this evidence, I did, but I did some processing of those early samples without the substrate controls,
Because you didn't have them.
because I did not have them.
And if you had them, you would have processed the substrate controls in the same fashion that you processed the specimens.
Yes, I would.
In the same fashion is vague, Your Honor.
Thank you. Now, talking about the issue of substrate controls, you performed analysis on Mr. Goldman's shirt.
Yes, I did.
Actually, I think I'm... And maybe while I'm playing with the board, could you maybe turn to your notes on that item?
Okay.
That would be LAPD item 81.
Yes.
And you attempted to take a substrate control from the shirt.
Well,
You cut one, I should
the
say.
correction on that would be that LAPD submitted a substrate control along with cuttings from the shirt, so I tested the cuttings.
Okay. So in other words, they cut an area which was labeled substrate control from the shirt. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you performed a PCR analysis of that substrate control.
Actually, that was performed by Renee Montgomery, but our laboratory did, yes. It was for D1S80, the PCR marker.
And you got a result of 1818 for that substrate control.
We characterized that as a trace of the 18 allele, yes.
And that would be a genotype consistent with the DNA from Nicole Brown Simpson.
Yes, it would.
And that's on Mr. Goldman's shirt.
Yes.
And did you examine the substrate control itself, that cutting?
Yes, I believe I did.
And did you see what appeared to be blood flakes on that shirt?
Yes, my notes on page 158 indicate that.
So in other words, in the substrate control on Mr. Goldman's shirt, you found flakes of blood, which using PCR typing, you were able to determine had a result that was consistent on the D1S80 system with Nicole Brown Simpson.
Yes.
Now, would that be consistent with withdrawn? You talked about how substrate controls can be evidence of samples being cross-contaminated.
Yes.
Would this finding you made on the substrate control be evidence that Mr. Goldman's shirt had been cross-contaminated with clothing from Nicole Brown Simpson?
Action calls for speculation, no foundation, improper hypothetical.
Or
Can you repeat exactly what you were saying?
Sure. Would this finding on the substrate control of Mr. Goldman's shirt be consistent with there having been a cross-contamination with this shirt and clothing of Nicole Brown Simpson that had her blood on it?
Would it be consistent with that? In other words, is that a possibility?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that's one possibility, yes.
Other possibilities are that Mr. Goldman's body was dragged across the crime scene into an area where it came into contact with blood from Nicole Brown Simpson.
Objection, improper hypothetical,
sustained.
calls for speculation.
You also got control, with respect to Nicole Brown Simpson's dress,
Yes.
did you receive substrate control cuttings or did you make some?
On that particular item, I did the sampling. I did not take a substrate control on that particular item because it was very bloody. The entire garment appeared to have blood, and it would seem to be hard to find an area with absolutely no blood on it.
But you did take 3 cuttings labeled G3, G5, and what would be the other one?
How about G6, maybe?
Yeah. And these were cuttings from around the right shoulder area.
Yes, the right upper back.
And you performed a D1S80 analysis on those cuttings, or Ms. Montgomery did.
Yes.
And you got findings of an 18 allele and a 24 allele.
On one of the cuttings, G3, it was an 18 allele with a weaker 24 allele, indicating a mixture. On G5 and G6, the type was determined to be 18,18 with a trace of the 24 allele.
And that mixture would be consistent with DNA typings of Nicole Brown Simpson, which for D1S80 are 1818,
Yes.
and traces of DNA from Ronald Goldman, whose type for the D180 system is 2424.
Yes.
Now, Your Honor, I have another question that I want to ask this witness, but before I do, I think I need to seek some guidance from the court.
All right, with the court order, please. Thank you, counsel. Mr. Scheck, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Sims, you discussed yesterday a study by the Federal Bureau of Investigation concerning efforts to induce cross-contamination in the handling of samples.
Yes.
I think at one point you talked about how this FBI study, they had FBI agents coughing over samples.
Well, I don't know that they were FBI agents. I think they were actually laboratory people that were not necessarily agents, but yes.
Laboratory people working for the FBI?
Well, I believe that work was done mainly by Dr. Comey, who is an employee of the FBI, and I think it was a woman by the name of Pamela Fish, who I believe is with the Chicago Police Department. I think those are the two that did those experiments.
Now, is there, to your knowledge, there's no such thing as a standardized cough by either FBI employees or employees of the Chicago Police Department?
Not that I'm aware of.
But there is a difference between a cough and a sneeze, isn't there?
Yes.
And a sneeze is more likely to, forgive my bringing up the details of this, but to give you an effluent or a spray than a cough.
It could, yes.
All right. And to your knowledge, they didn't even, they did not sneeze on any samples.
To my knowledge, I don't recall that being in the table. No, I think it was more of the cough.
Now, there was discussion in that study of saliva.
Yes.
And they did find that saliva mixed with blood, that actually the amount of DNA that you'll get from the saliva mixture is 2 times the amount that you would get from the blood.
I don't recall it being 2 times, but yes, the saliva could make a significant contribution.
And scientifically that makes sense to you, doesn't it? Because saliva, in terms of its volume, has a higher concentration of DNA than blood.
Well, I think saliva can have a lot of DNA in it because of the cells that line the mouth, but there is tremendous variation, just as there is from cough to cough, from spit to spit.
Well, in general, no matter who's, if you compare somebody's spit to somebody's blood, right, in equal volumes, you're going to find more DNA in the spit than the blood.
You may well find more, but again, it varies.
Well, in blood, the DNA comes from the white cells.
That's correct.
And but over 50% of the cellular material in blood is red cells.
Yes, something like that. Well, no, what did you say, over 50? Yes, well over 50%.
Well over 50%.
Yes.
And the red cells do not have a nucleus.
That's correct.
So they don't have DNA in them.
That's correct.
And the DNA in the blood comes from the white cells.
Yes.
And that's about 1% of the cellular material in blood.
Something like that, yes.
And just to illustrate it, the kinds of things you do in the laboratory, there's something called a centrifuge.
Yes.
And so you would take like a test tube of blood and you'd spin it around.
Yes.
And what would happen is that the cellular material would go to the bottom of the tube.
Well, the red cells tend to sediment, and then the white cells tend to form a layer on top.
Right. And so that you see a sediment of the red cells at the bottom of the tube.
Yes, and occupying a lot of the tube at that point.
And then there's a thin film that I think people in your line of work call a buffy coat.
Yes, that's called the buffy coat.
And that's where you'll have the white blood cells.
Yes.
And then I guess there's something yellowish on the top. That's sort of the serum, the platelets.
Yes, the serum of the plasma, yes.
Now, let's take a centrifuge tube and spin it around with saliva.
Okay.
And at the bottom of that, you'd see a sediment of the epithelial cells, right?
Yes.
The epithelial cells are the cells from skin,
Well, and also they're the ones that line the mouth, for
the
example.
inside of the mouth, right?
Right. They're different than the ones that would be on your epidermis, for example.
Right. And the epithelial cells that you get from the saliva, if you looked at the bottom of the test tube, that would be what you'd see at the bottom.
Yes.
And so if you were to just take a volume of blood and a volume of saliva typically, right?
Yes.
Spin it around in those tubes, right?
Yes.
You look at that Buffy coat, which would be the amount of the white cells or the amount of DNA you could get out of that volume of blood, right?
Right.
And typically compare it to the other tube where you would have the cells from the epithelial cells from the saliva, right?
Yes.
If the same volumes, you would expect to see more DNA from the epithelial cells in the saliva, typically.
Well, the problem with saliva is it's not like blood. Blood tends to be more typical in that when you draw it out of the arm, people's bloods all tend to look alike. Their DNA content may vary, but they tend to look alike. But saliva does vary a lot because we take saliva samples from, for example, suspects and victims in sexual assault cases. So you look at these things and you see a lot of variation. But there can be, to make this short, there can be a significant amount of epithelial cells in saliva.
Right. So to get back to our FBI study, right?
Okay?
You would be more likely to find epithelial cells from the effluent of a sneeze, wouldn't you, than a cough?
Well, if I mean, you have to remember some people, when they cough, they really hack a lot, and so they may be producing a lot of phlegm.
All right. Let's getting to the bottom line here. In terms of this FBI study, I think it might have been a reasonable idea, instead of having some undefined kind of coughing, to have somebody sneeze.
Yes.
Objection, it's irrelevant.
Overruled. Angela stand. Proceed.
Now,
Yes, I think. Okay.
talking again about that FBI study, bottom line here, the samples involved in that study, right? The samples that they were looking at in terms of trying to see whether there were cross-contamination did not involve degraded samples, did it?
That's correct. That's my understanding.
And the discussion that we've been having here has to do with the possibility of cross-contamination of one set of samples that are degraded.
Yes.
Now, you gave some testimony about false positives versus false negatives.
Yes.
And you were asked, is it your opinion that a typing error in the PCR process is more likely to result in a false exclusion than an inclusion?
Generally, yes.
Well, that was the question you were asked yesterday.
Yes.
Now, your experience is in forensic DNA typing.
Yes.
And I take it that your answer was based on your experience in forensic DNA typing.
Yes.
And when you're doing forensic DNA typing, typically that involves a case where you will get a result, a DNA result, and then it will be introduced in court and maybe against somebody who was accused.
Or it may well give a result that exonerates some person.
Can happen, but when it's being used for purposes of incriminating, it is used for, let's put it this way. Talking about false positives and false negatives,
Yes.
there are many situations where you have what we would characterize as a positive result. That is, there is a consistency between DNA typing found on some sample and a person that's accused, and that would be called, let's say, a, quote, positive result.
Yes, you can use it in that context.
And you had that in mind when you were answering the false positive question yesterday.
Yes.
Now, when you're using PCR typing for purposes of making a diagnosis in a clinical test.
Objection, it's irrelevant.
Sustained.
Oh, no, you were asked yesterday about, in this connection, about, you made reference to an article by Dr. Sensabaugh concerning false positive rates and PCR typing.
Objection, that misstates the testimony. There was no such testimony in rates.
Sustained.
Do you know what the false positive rates are for PCR typing in clinical medicine?
No.
Do you know, you were asked questions comparing forensic typing in DNA typing in forensics and clinical medicine yesterday by Mr. Harmon.
Yes.
All right. And let's just talk about what you do know with respect to the use of forensic typing in clinical medicine.
Okay.
Do you know if PCR typing in clinical medicine is used to do a diagnosis of, let's say, do you know what a pap smear is?
Yes.
All right. A situation where an analysis might be done on a pap smear to see whether or not somebody might have a tumor that is either malignant or benign.
Objection, it's irrelevant, beyond the scope.
Sustained.
When PCR typing is used as a screening device in clinical medicine, do you know if it is used in situations to make an assessment as to whether or not somebody, where you will make a prediction based on the typing result as to whether or not somebody has, let's say, a certain genetic disease?
Objection, it's irrelevant, beyond the scope, no foundation.
Sustained.
Do you know if in clinical medicine using PCR typing, one can make a comparison of what the DNA typing result is and compare it later to whether or not the typing result accurately predicted the outcome?
Your Honor.
Sustained.
Objection.
Foundation. Sustained.
I'm asking if he knows.
It's beyond the scope as well, counsel.
Using forensic DNA typing in the context of a criminal case, the only way that you can find out if you had a false positive is if some other evidence emerges afterwards which would indicate that the DNA typing was incorrect.
Objection, it's argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Well, you're aware of the CACLD studies.
Yes.
And in the first round of CACLD studies, 2 laboratories, Cellmark, Forensic Science Associates, got false positives.
Objection, it's beyond the scope, no foundation, may call for hearsay.
Sustained.
Do you know if Cellmark and Forensic Science Associates...
Counsel, I'm sustaining the objection on a hearsay basis at this point.
Have you read the results, the report of the CACLD study?
Objection, it's irrelevant, beyond the
Just
scope.
first question.
Overruled.
No.
Have you read reports of that study?
I have read some information about that study, yes.
And the information that you've read about that study, do you rely upon it?
Objection, it's vague, rely on what, for what reason?
Sustained.
Have you relied upon it in forming your opinion about the reliability of forensic DNA typing?
Still vague, counsel. Relied on what? What article specifically?
Have you relied on the literature you have read concerning the CACLD studies?
Still sustained. We're not identifying what it is we're referring to.
Or what is it that you've read with respect to the CACLD studies?
Well, for example, Dr. Blake,
That may call for hearsay, that does call for hearsay, Your Honor.
No, what he has read regarding the CACLD study is not hearsay. Overruled.
You may
Well,
answer.
I know, for example, that Dr. Blake mentioned it in the casework article, the experience he had and why it was better, where he found it was better to shift to the reverse dot blot.
No, the only question is, what have you read with regards to the CACLD study?
Have you read any? I'm
All
sorry,
right,
go ahead.
Dr. Blake's article, we've
What
established
else
that.
have you read?
I think there's a mention of the CACLD study in the NRC report, and I think there's a mention of it in, I recall reading something about it, I think in Dr. Thompson's article.
In what you've read, would you rely upon those articles that you've read in terms of their accuracy in reporting what occurred in the CACLD study?
Sustained.
Would you rely upon what you've read in terms of forming your
Excuse me,
opinion?
counsel, the way you're phrasing that question, it's never going to work.
Oh, okay. Then I have to find another way.
I guess so. This doesn't look particularly fruitful here.
Well,
The jury has already heard about the CACLD study and has also heard testimony from Selmark.
right.
So let's
To your
move.
knowledge, in proficiency tests performed by the CACLD, were there more false positives than false negatives?
Objection, possible hearsay, it's beyond the scope.
Sustained.
I don't recall.
Oh,
the-
you can't answer.
Sustained.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Sims, let's discuss for a few minutes the fingernails.
Okay.
Now, you told us that you had considerable experience in conventional serology.
Yes.
And how many years was that?
Well, in conventional serology, I actually started doing conventional serology back in 1976, so I guess I did that for about 14 years, something like that.
And have you worked with the EAP system?
Yes, I have.
And I believe you've told us that, well, withdrawn. And the EAP system looks at enzymes within the red blood cells.
Yes, it does.
And forensic DNA testing with DQ alpha or polymarkers would be looking at nucleated cells, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you've already told us that in terms of blood, only 1% of blood contains the white cells that has the nuclear DNA.
So, something like that. I know that figure a little differently from my knowledge, but it's on that order.
Mm-hmm.
Blood is mostly red cells. That's the point, and very few white cells by comparison.
When you open the packages that contain the fingernail scrapings, you receive the packages that contain the fingernail scrapings and the clippings.
Yes.
And you opened them up and you looked at them when you received them at the lab.
Yes, I did.
And at that time, you were aware that Mr. Matheson had conducted EAP testing and conventional serology testing on scrapings.
Yes, I was aware of that.
And were you aware of his results, reported results?
Yes, I believe I was aware of that result.
And after looking at those packages, did you then close them up without conducting any testing on them and send them back to LAPD?
Well, I did close them up, but I didn't send them back at that point.
You closed them up and you didn't perform any testing.
That's correct.
And did you have any discussions with Mr. Matheson after you closed up the packages?
I think I did. I'm not positive of that, but I think I did talk to Mr. Matheson about the fingernail scrapings.
And did you suggest that a second EAP test should be run.
Objection, cause for hearsay.
Sustain.
Well, Mr. Sims, are you aware of literature that documents a degradation pattern for the EAP system?
Yes.
And in that literature, have you ever, in that literature, is there any degradation pattern that shows that a BA can degrade into a two-banded B pattern?
Well, most of the literature that I'm familiar with talks about what generally happens, although I do recall reading in the literature a citation for I think it was in one of the British laboratories where they saw a BA be mistyped as a B. And that I've seen that in the literature, not as part of a study, but as an observation.
Could you answer my question?
Well, yes, it's in there.
All right.
I've seen that in the
Have you
literature.
seen in the literature any documentation of a degradation pattern where a BA degrades into a two-banded B pattern?
I don't recall seeing that, unless there may have been something in one of Dr. Grinbaum's papers, but I can't cite it offhand.
And Dr. Sensabaugh is the person that's done, would you agree, the most extensive work in examining the EAP system?
I would say that Dr. Sensabaugh knows more about EAP than just about anybody.
And in his published articles, have you ever seen anything that documents a degradation pattern where a BA degrades into a two-banded B pattern? Anything he has written?
No, I can't recall seeing that.
In your own experience, in all the years that you have performed conventional serology, have you ever seen a BA degrade into a two-banded B pattern?
Well, the problem with the EAP marker, I mean, I can recall generating a lot of inconclusive results with EAP because it can be a difficult marker.
But my question, sir.
Well, let him finish his
I'm
answer.
sorry, are you finished?
Well, I think in order to do that, you have to be assured of what the type is to begin with. If you understand what I'm saying. In other words, if I have a stain, I have to be sure of the type to begin with. You'd have to do it as a research project.
Mr. Sims, I'm just talking about your experience now in typing. Have you personally ever seen a BA degrade into a two-banded B pattern? Have you ever seen that, yes or no?
Where I knew that it was a BA,
Degrade into a two-banded B pattern.
I can't recall seeing that, no.
Mr. Sims, I'd like to discuss with you PCR carryover contamination.
Okay?
Now, I'm going to start this. It's going to take more than 15 minutes. 1133. That's what I mean. Now, Mr. Sims, in the PCR amplification process, whether you're using the DQ alpha system, the polymarker system, or the D1S80 system, in terms of basic principles, would it be fair to say that what is happening is one is starting with a certain amount of genetic material,
Yes.
and then what happens is that in the PCR amplification process itself, there is what are known as cycles.
Yes.
Could you explain that for us, how that works? And how a piece of starting material is amplified up into many larger fragments? Many more fragments.
More fragments, right, not larger. This is the PCR process, and I won't go into great detail with this, but what you're doing is you're starting with a certain amount of what we call template DNA. In other words, that's the DNA that you extracted from the stain. And then you are doing what is called amplifying a particular segment of that DNA, a very small, relatively small portion of that DNA. And you're using that then to that repetitive, or you're making additional copies of a particular area, then you're making copies from copies and copies from copies and so on and so on. And that's why you see what we call this exponential expansion of the number of fragments that you get.
Now, let us assume that the starting material here, all right, contains DNA for, let's pick the DQ alpha system, all right?
Okay.
And in the DQ alpha system, you have a series of different alleles.
Yes.
And they're about how many base pairs long for the most part?
About 240 base pairs, the area of interest.
Let's assume for purposes of this that in this starting material, we're talking about DNA that has the genotype 1.3, 1.3 for the DQ alpha system.
Okay.
So in other words, would it be fair to say that when you begin making the copies from that starting material, that with each different cycle, you're producing more and more fragments that are about, what, 269 base pairs long?
About 240.
240 base pairs long that are little copies of that 1.3 allele.
Yes.
And as the cycles go on, you're producing, what's this number at the end? After 32 cycles?
It looks like you've got 4,290,000,000 fragments. Fragments.
290 million fragments of that 1.3 allele.
Yes.
That's 240
Base pairs long. Yes.
And when you do that amplification with one of these little microfuge tubes, after you put it in that thermocycler machine, you're going to get inside that tube 4,290,000,000 fragments of 1.3.
Well, again, it depends on your starting material, but that's the idea. That's proper.
And a single amplification could contain something on the order of 1 trillion copies of an amplified target sequence.
I don't think at our levels that we get up to 1 trillion copies. I think maybe 1 billion is sort of the neighborhood.
1 billion copies. And when we talk about the amplified target sequence here, we're talking about that 1.3.
That's correct.
And would you agree that that is a staggering number of molecules?
Well, no, it's not really a staggering number of molecules. I mean, you look at the air, think how many molecules are in the air and that sort of thing. It's not a staggering number of molecules, it's just a large number,
Pretty large number, right?
but not in terms of molecules.
Well, it's enough to cover many square miles of land. If you just took them out of the tube and spread them out.
Maybe in a string or something like that.
Mhm.
I suppose there could be something like that, yes.
And with the contents of that reaction, with these 4,290,000,000 fragments, it certainly, if it got out of that tube, could cover a lot of square footage in a laboratory.
Yes, there could be some significant number of copies. That's true.
And in a DNA laboratory, when you're doing these PCR tests, you are amplifying up in the tubes these billions of fragments again and again and again.
Well, for example, if you did several samples, yes, each tube would contain that large number of fragments, yes.
And if some of these fragments, are these fragments, one of these fragments, is it visible to the naked eye?
Yes, it would be.
One of those fragments?
Yes.
How small would it be?
You couldn't see it. Yeah, you couldn't see it. I mean, it's extremely tiny. We're talking about things on the atomic, well, it's not an atom, obviously, it's several atoms, but you can't see it.
I misspoke when I said it's visible to the naked eye. You're talking about seeing it under a microscope?
No, you couldn't see that under a microscope.
All right, so you couldn't see it.
No, you couldn't see it.
All right. With that not being able to see, Your Honor, I think that before I move on to the next aspect of it, this might be good.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief 10-minute recess. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you. Don't perform any deliberations until the matter has been submitted to you. We'll stand in recess for 10 minutes.
My proposal is just to show him that has the numbers he testified to, and introduce it and move on.
Mr. Harmon?
The one that jumps out as being grossly perverted is 52. And Robin Cotton, as I recall, said 25 to 60. So, this is
Just his answers to my hypothetical, based on his quantitations.
remember my better late than never yesterday, Your Honor. That hypothetical was based on a lot of things that have no resemblance to reality, including 52. I mean, that is the state of the record with respect to cell marks. So, and that points out why these argumentative distortions of what's been presented here, they may be great for Mr. Cochran's closing argument, but even at that point, I think you'd look at them with a dim view. And I hope you would, anyway.
Your Honor, this is just a straightforward, clear, simple graphic of what the testimony was yesterday, based on
Aren't
hypothetical.
computers wonderful?
They are.
All right, I'll overrule the previous objections. However, I anticipate 5 or 6 rather pointed questions from Mr. Harmon regarding the underlying assumptions.
I did too.
Okay, let's proceed. Let's have the jury, please.
Your Honor, could I just comment? If you have those questions about the legitimacy of the assumptions, then why don't you defer on letting the jury see this rather than seeing it and then let me straighten it out next Wednesday or Thursday. I thought we were keeping them from
Well,
being
counsel, you know, in
misled.
looking at all of this, the issue is whether or not it would be misleading. Under the hypothetical that Mr. Scheck, and with his assumptions, it was an appropriate hypothetical question. However, I suspect that you will be able to come back and counter some of those assumptions. And I have already instructed the jury regarding the assumptions made in hypothetical questions. Let's proceed.
Could you instruct them again, then, Your Honor, before we actually show them a manifestation of
I'm not going to pinpoint instructions for either party at any particular time. Mr. Sims, why don't you go ahead and take your seat. All right, let the record reflect that we have been rejoined now by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Sims is again on the witness stand, and Mr. Scheck, you may continue with your cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Sims, to move back to our discussion of PCR carryover contamination. Now, referring you again to the chart that's 1133. Now, these 4,290,000,000 fragments that are produced by an amplification is the term that is sometimes used to describe a single one of those fragments, an amplicon fragment.
Yes, I've seen that term in the literature.
And sometimes it's just referred to as an amplicon.
Yes.
And under the discussion we were having of this 32 cycles of one fragment, we were assuming it was the starting material was...
Excuse me, Mr. Scheck.
Sorry?
Excuse me, just a second. All right, proceed.
We were assuming the starting material here was a 1.3, 1.3.
Okay.
And so that would mean that the 4,290,000,000 amplicon fragments were these 1.3, 1.3 fragments from the DQ alpha system.
Yes.
And just as we broke, you indicated to us that one of those fragments is invisible.
Yes.
And if a number of these invisible fragments were to get from one of these tubes into another tube, that could cause what's known as PCR carryover contamination.
objection vague as to a number.
Oh,
Well, again, it would depend on the number.
How many of these amplicon fragments, these 1.3 fragments, would it take to, when it transferred to another tube where it shouldn't be, to create one of those little 1.3 dots on a DQ alpha strip?
Well, it's not just to create the dot, it's actually to get a typable result. Is that what you mean? To get a typable result, we'd need about 100 of them, something like that.
100.
100, yes.
Only 100 out of those 4,290,000,000 fragments being transferred to another tube would cause a 1.3 contaminant on a strip.
Yes.
And have you ever heard the term exquisite sensitivity applied to the PCR technique?
Yes, I have.
And by exquisite sensitivity, it is meant that the ability of the PCR process to amplify up very small amounts of starting material means that it is a very sensitive form of testing.
Yes, it is.
And by sensitivity, we're talking about the ability to detect small amounts of, in this case, DNA.
Yes.
If one takes one of those microfuge tubes with the top and pops it up and gets a small aerosol, gets on a glove, gets on the rim of another tube, and then gets into a second tube, and only 100 of those fragments gets into that second tube, that can cause a PCR carryover contamination, which would create one of those typable 1.3 dots lighting up on a strip.
Well, no, that by itself wouldn't cause that. The way you phrased that, that's
Right.
not what you're talking about.
It gets into the tube, and then you amplify it up, and then you see the dot on the strip.
In other words, if some of that amplified product, that number of copies we talked about, got back into another tube, and then that got amplified, then that's correct, yes. But you have to amplify what you got in the tube. That's right.
Now, because these amplified products, it only takes 100 of them, I think you said,
Yes.
to create a contaminant typing result.
Yes.
PCR laboratories, whether doing forensic typing or typing for clinical medicine, have to be very, very concerned about carryover contamination.
You have to be very concerned about that, yes.
You have to take very strict precautions to make sure that amplified product, these fragments, are not accidentally spread around.
You have to take strict precautions, yes.
And you need to take strict precautions because only 100 of these invisible fragments can cause that contaminant.
Yes, in other words, 100 of those fragments all landing in the same place, the same tube as you mentioned, yes.
Now, in your amplified fragments, these invisible amplified fragments can get on people's shoes.
I suppose they could if there was some on the floor, for example, and you stepped in it.
And you could carry them to another section of the laboratory if one isn't careful.
Yes, I suppose that could happen.
And you can get on clothing.
Yes.
And if you carry that to another part of the laboratory, then touch your clothing and put your hand down on a surface that can spread the amplicons.
Yes, that could spread them out, yes.
And then that spread of the amplicons can somehow get on an analyst's hands or clothing and then start getting into reagents.
It's somewhat of a circuitous route, but I suppose theoretically all that could happen.
Well, isn't that, in your understanding of the literature in this area, more than a theoretical problem?
Well, most of the concern has come about, for example, in the way instrumentation such as pipettes are used or that sort of thing, but that is part of the issue, is you want to isolate the PCR product. There's no doubt about that.
No doubt about it.
No doubt about that.
And that's why in your laboratories, withdrawn. Now, once one gets PCR carryover contamination in a laboratory, it is hard to pinpoint exactly where it came from.
In other words, if one saw a large amount of it, in other words, a large number of samples that were contaminated, is that what you're saying? Yes, it could be difficult to isolate that.
And in the literature on PCR typing, there has been much written about measures that could be taken in laboratories to prevent carryover or amplicon contamination, as it's called.
Yes.
One precaution that has been suggested is the use of an enzyme known as UNG.
Yes.
Actually, I think it stands for, this may be more information than we need, uracil N-glycolase.
Want to spell that?
Sure.
Or is it glycosilase, maybe?
Uracil, U-R-A-C-I-L, new word, capital N dash G-L-Y-C-O-L-A-S-E. Yes?
I believe that's right, yes.
Typically, otherwise known as UNG.
Ung.
And this is an enzyme that can be put into the PCR process that can prevent, it can be used to prevent amplification of carryover amplicons from a previous amplification run.
Yes, that's one approach that was proposed some time back. Nobody's adopted it in forensic use because we haven't found the need for it.
Nobody in the forensic laboratories has adopted it.
That's correct.
But in PCR typing, for purposes of clinical diagnosis, this is a widely used technique, isn't it?
Objections irrelevant, cause for speculation.
Sustained.
Do you know if UNG is used in clinical laboratories as a precaution against PCR carryover contamination?
Objection, cause for hearsay, speculation.
No.
Sustained.
Are you familiar with the section concerning PCR carryover contamination in the NRC report?
Objections irrelevant.
Call your attention to page 67.
Irrelevant.
Are you familiar with that?
I've read it.
All right. Do you rely upon the on that section of the,
Objection.
rephrase the question. Do you rely on the section of the NRC report that discusses
Objection.
PCR carryover contamination in formulating your opinions
Your Honor, I
about
object.
PCR
That's
typing?
hearsay in the form of that question, Your Honor.
Well, counsel, if you're talking at the same time, I can't hear the question, I can't hear the objection at the same time. Restate the question.
Do you rely on the section of the National Academy of Sciences report concerning PCR carryover contamination?
No.
Proceed.
Is Dr. George Sensabaugh one of the authors of this NRC report?
Yes, I believe he was one of the authors of the report.
Is that the same Dr. George Sensabaugh that was the author of those articles, or a number of the articles that Mr. Harmon referred you to on direct examination?
Yes.
Now, so you don't use UNG as a precaution against PCR carryover contamination in your laboratory.
That's correct. We found no need for it.
Now, ultraviolet light can be used as a precaution against PCR carryover contamination.
Yes.
Literally, if you expose the DNA to ultraviolet light, it does something that they call cross-link it.
Yes, you get cross-linking, thymine, dimers, that sort of thing.
And in simple terms, what that means is if you expose the amplicons to ultraviolet light, you will sort of deactivate them to the point where they can't be amplified up as carryover contamination.
That's the basic idea, yes.
And so ultraviolet light can be used as a way of as a precaution against PCR carryover contamination getting on surfaces.
Yes.
And I think you indicated that when you take notes in your forensic typing, you do it as the work is performed.
Yes.
So you would be there with your paper, your notes, the paper on which you make your notes, as you're performing some of these functions.
Yes.
And as a precaution, do you take the pages of your notes and put it in some machine to expose them to ultraviolet light?
Well, what I do is I take the pages that have been in the PCR room, that's our product room, I expose those in a device called a stratolinker, which it zaps them basically with this ultraviolet light, and then I do that both sides of the paper before I remove it from that room.
And the reason that you literally take the pieces of paper that you bring into that PCR product room, and then you put it in, what did you call it, a contraption?
The device is called a stratolinker.
Right. You put it in there, you expose both sides of the paper to the ultraviolet light, right?
Yes.
So that's to make sure that the paper that you're carrying out of that PCR product room doesn't contain any of these amplicons.
Yes.
That's I'm sorry.
Well, yes, that's to, again, expose it to the UV light. It's a protective device.
That's how careful one has to be.
Well, that's, we are probably overboard on that matter, but we think it's a good idea because that paper may have been, for example, on a lab bench in the PCR room.
When you say overboard, you're talking in terms of comparing forensic DNA laboratories, right? You're comparing yourself to other forensic DNA laboratories.
Yes, that's all I know about.
Right. You don't know very much about what clinical laboratories do in terms of trying to prevent PCR carryover contamination.
I don't know a great deal about that. That's correct.
And would it be fair to say that the PCR typing process has been used in clinical laboratories far longer than it has been in forensic laboratories?
No foundation, it's irrelevant.
Do you know the answer to that question?
No.
Proceed.
Is it fair to say that most of the forensic laboratories that you've been referring to for your knowledge are laboratories that are connected with law enforcement?
Yes.
So basically what's happening, I think you even described it on direct, is that law enforcement, police crime laboratories, have been taking a PCR technology that was first introduced in clinical medicine, the first application, and in research, and transferring it into the crime laboratory.
No foundation, speculation.
Well, I don't know. You said first. I know Dr. Blake, who's a forensic analyst, was using this stuff in 1985 or 6. I mean, he was in the same building as the CETUS company that developed it. So I don't know that you can actually say that clinical medicine people were using it before Dr. Blake was.
Well,
I'm struggling with that one.
well, you know Dr. Carey Mullis.
I don't know him personally.
You know who he is.
I know who he is.
He invented PCR technique.
Yes, I believe his name is on the patent along with some other people.
He won the Nobel Prize.
He won the Nobel Prize.
Now, in your laboratory, at the end of the PCR typing process, you go into something that you call a what room?
Product room.
Product room. And that's where these tubes are amplified up.
Yes, that's where the amplification and typing takes place.
And that's where you do your PCR product gel.
Yes.
And it's in your protocol that you never take PCR product out of that room.
Well, we never process it away from that room. That's correct. We would not do that.
And that's because of this danger of carryover contamination.
That's correct.
Every tool in that PCR product room is a dedicated tool.
Yes, it is.
You don't take a pin that you would use in that room out of the room, do you?
That's correct.
You don't take the lab coat out of that room.
That's correct.
You don't take any gloves out of that room.
That's correct.
You don't take any tubes out of that room.
That's correct.
And you would never, in your laboratory, take the PCR tubes out of that room, put it in a car, drive it for a mile, bring it into another laboratory, and then in another room in a laboratory, perform a PCR product gel.
Objection.
Would you?
No foundation, calls for speculation. It's
Sustain.
irrelevant,
Phrase the question.
beyond the scope.
Would you ever take tubes out of your PCR product room and perform what's known as a PCR product gel in another room in your laboratory?
Objection, it's vague in terms of what another room is.
Overruled.
No, it would always be contained in the PCR product room because of the way our lab is set up.
And that's because it's a one-way workflow.
That's correct.
And that's what's recommended by, in forensic laboratories and any other laboratory that you know of that does PCR typing, that you should have a one-way workflow and the PCR product should not leave that last room.
That's the basic idea, yes. In other words, you work on a sample, you extract it, then you move into the PCR room for the final step.
And could you just tell the jury what a PCR product gel is?
A PCR product gel is another one of these mini gels I think Dr. Cotton may have referred to. It's sort of like a yield gel, but it just tells you whether or not you got PCR product out of your amplification. In other words, it evaluates whether or not this amplification process was a success. Because if it was a success, you'll see a band for the DNA size fragment. We mentioned about 240 base pairs on your gel.
And to perform a PCR product gel, bottom line, you would be taking some tubes that contain these amplicon fragments. You would have to be using that. Be using amplified
Yes,
product.
yes.
Mr. Sims, let's discuss the glove.
Okay.
And in preparation for that, I would ask you to turn to, I guess it's page 69 of your notes, while I search for one of the glove boards. Number 272A.
Excuse me, counsel, we're missing the other board that goes with this.
Oh, I don't do it.
Yes.
For my purposes now, but I wouldn't mind using it, but,
No, that was our agreement.
oh, the two of them would always be done together. You're absolutely right, Your Honor. It's just a question of logistics, but I thank you.
Deal's a deal.
So I guess that means another,
Yes.
he's, while we're doing that. Show Mr. Harmon some photographs that he has. While they're searching for this word, I'll show the witness these photos.
Proceed.
Excuse me.
Can you get the,
Mr. Scheck.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you examine those photographs?
Yes.
Any problem with these?
No.
Now, let's just, you began your examination of the glove on October 15th.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
What I'd like to do with you now is just go over what you did and how long it took you to do it, to cut from the glove 4 samples. I believe they are G1, G2, G3, and G4.
Oh,
Okay?
Okay, but when you say cut, I mean, I'm also spending a lot of time documenting, photographing, and Dr. Blake is taking photographs too, so.
That's
it's-
right.
It's not right to just say, how long did I take to cut?
No, no, I'm
Okay.
going to take you through it step by step,
Okay,
starting at page 69 of your notes.
okay,
On October 15th, at about 3:15, you began an examination of this glove, which you received on September 7th.
that's correct.
And you photographed it and you made a diagram.
Yes, I did.
All right, and this took you, and at that time, the glove was turned inside out, as reflected on the top left-hand photograph in People's Exhibit 272A.
Yes, it was inside out.
That's how it was when you received it.
Yes.
And you then on when you were examining the glove on October 15th, you also did some presumptive testing on different areas of the glove.
That's correct.
And could you tell us exactly what that is and how you did it?
Okay. The presumptive blood testing is with it's a color test or reagent that when applied, in this case I used orthotolidine, and what one first does is to take a swab and then touch lightly the area of interest where you think there's blood, and then you take that swab now and drop sequentially reagents upon it, the orthotolidine followed by the hydrogen peroxide, and since blood has the what's called a peroxidase-like activity associated with it, if there's blood there, it will turn the reagent blue. You see a nice blue color.
Mr. Simpson, do you spell orthotolidine for the court reporter?
Yes, ORTHO-TOLIDINE.
Thank you.
And the purpose of going over the glove with this otolidine test and looking for all areas that you might think was blood was to identify all the areas that you could see on the inside surface of the glove that you thought would be relevant for purposes of DNA testing.
Well, that's right, except I would probably take out the word all. I'm not sure. There's a lot of blood on that glove, so, but those are the areas I focused on.
And to do this, it took you about 2.5 hours.
Objection, it's vague as to what this is.
Stay.
The examination, documentation, and presumptive testing of the surface of the glove took you, all those activities that you've described on October 15th took you about 2.5 hours. Or you tell me how long it took.
That's approximately correct. Yes, all the activities of that day took about that much time.
Then on October 16th, the next day, you made some cuttings.
Yes,
You cut G1 from, I guess it's the pointer finger,
the index finger, yes.
and G2
Yes, that's from the side of the middle finger.
and G3,
That's from the ring finger.
all right, and G4.
Yes, that was now down into towards the middle of the hand.
So, in other words, you were taking cuttings from the index finger, is that right?
That's correct.
And the inside of the middle finger,
Yes, that's correct.
and then from something that would be equivalent on, if you return the glove, out again, right? The inside of, what do you call this finger?
The ring finger.
Ring finger, right?
Yes,
All right. Looking for blood in those areas,
yes,
right? Then you also looked at an area that would be the middle of the palm, right?
I think we're now talking.
G4.
G4 is actually, I think, the back of the hand, because it's inside out. If you look
It's
at
inside out, the back of the hand?
Excuse me, Mr. Scheck, you keep talking over.
I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Sims.
May I step down?
You may.
Yeah, please.
Why don't you grab the pointer?
G4 is on the back of the hand. It's hard to think because it's inside out. You have to think about it. This notch here is what we call a palmar surface. In other words, that's the surface that the palm would be. And then this G4 then is on the back of the hand.
Okay. Now, to do these four cuttings right?
Yes.
Between each cutting, in your notes, you indicated that you went through the procedure before where you cleaned your instruments with water and alcohol and flamed them.
Yes.
And under each of the cuttings, you put a new one of those chem wipes,
Yes, I did.
all right? When you handled each one of those cuttings.
Yes.
And you changed gloves between each one of the cuttings, or cleaned, or put on, washed your gloves.
Now that, I don't recall in this particular examination that I did that each time. I'm not sure that I did that each time because this was all one item.
You might have.
Well, I might have,
Objection
but
calls for speculation. Your Honor.
Sustained.
Now, how long did it take you to do those 4 cuttings? About 5 hours and 40 minutes?
no, I think there's a follow-up. This was a Sunday afternoon, and I think there was still follow-up time. There were additional samples taken and additional documentation that Sunday.
Well, I'm just curious, if you could, to the best of your recollection, using your notes, how long do you think it took you to do the cuttings for those 4 samples?
Oh, those 4 samples?
And the documentation and your usual procedures?
Probably an hour, something like that, at least, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, something like that, maybe an hour and a half, I'm not sure.
And did there come a point where you proceeded on October 17th with the organic extraction, or your extraction process on those samples?
Let me check my notes on that. Which page were you referring to?
Well, page 72.
Yes, page 72, this would now be October 16th. This is when I began the extraction of those samples.
About how long did that take you?
The first portion that night was fairly quick because I just at that point had all my tubes set up and I just had to add a couple reagents to those tubes and then that went overnight. The extraction process takes overnight. You let this, to get this DNA out, you have to, and with our procedure you have to go overnight. So then we begin now at the 17th.
How long?
Well, that would probably take about a half an hour, something like that on the 16th.
The organic extraction?
The start of the organic extraction on the 16th would take about a half an hour.
All right. And then how long did it take you to finish the organic extraction on the next day? Page 77.
So this goes from 72, I guess, over to page 75. I would say I spent probably, half a day at least. I worked very slowly, but something like a half day, maybe 4 or 5 hours, something like that.
And then did there come a point when you did an amplification of these G1, G2, G3, and G4?
Yes.
How long did that take?
This would now be after the yield gel.
Yeah, we'd do a yield gel. How long did that take?
Excuse me. The yield gel runs for about an hour. This was a pretty long day. Let's see, Yeah, I have Dr. Blake coming over around 2100 hours, so that would be what, around 9 o'clock, I guess. I'm running the yield gel during that time. I think it's not then till about the 18th. I have Blake depart at 12 a.m., so that would be midnight. And I think that the actual setup then starts on the 18th. That would probably take about an hour and a half, something like that. There were some calculations based on the yield gel made, and then there was some laying out of what we were going to amplify. So that would take about an hour and a half, something like that.
All right, and then finally, when you do your amplification run and you get your typing results, about how long did that part of the process take for these 4 samples?
The typing usually is about half a day. I'd say about 4 hours it takes to do the typing. And then if the product gel is run, that's another hour or so.
Now, I heard you say that you work slowly, you said?
Yes, I do.
Well, you work carefully.
Well, yes, I'm very careful. I think I'm very careful.
Nothing wrong with that, is there?
Well, from a production standpoint, it's not. I don't think it's all that good. But in terms of getting the right result, I think it's important to take one's time to do a good job.
Yes. Now, looking at all your results, both on 272A, which is the picture of the glove, and 272B, would it be fair to say that the predominant source of DNA on this glove, whether it be through RFLP typing or PCR-based typing, is consistent with Ronald Goldman?
Well, I can only address those issues, those places where I sampled. You have to remember there's a lot of blood on this glove.
Yes.
And from the areas that I sampled, I mean, there's a great deal of mixing going on, but overall, from the areas that I sampled, I would say yes, Mr. Goldman's types were predominant in those areas.
Whether you're looking at the band intensities in RFLP or the dot intensities in PCR or the band intensities in D1S80, it would be your conclusion that his DNA was the predominant source on this glove in most of the areas.
Objection, that misstates the testimony, calls for speculation.
Sustained. Phrase question.
All right. And each of the areas, we'll take it. And would you agree that that DNA consistent with Mr. Goldman's type, different typing procedures, was the predominant source?
Yes.
Now, you found no trace of DNA consistent with Mr. Simpson in G1, the index finger.
That's correct.
You found no trace of DNA consistent with Mr. Simpson in G2, the middle finger.
That's correct.
You found no trace of Mr. Simpson's DNA consistent with Mr. Simpson in the ring finger.
That's correct.
You found no trace of DNA consistent with Mr. Simpson in G4 at the back of the hand.
That's correct.
At G14, the bottom of the glove, you found no trace of DNA consistent with Mr. Simpson.
That's correct.
All right? The 3 areas where you found traces of DNA on the D1S80 system that were consistent with Mr. Simpson were G10, G11, and G13.
Yes.
Now, turning first to G10. You extracted a total of 44 nanograms of DNA.
I'll check that. That's, actually, there's a little more than that because this was now available after the quantitation. So it was a little over 44 nanograms, yes.
And looking at band intensities on the D1S80 system, would you say that the proportion, let me ask you, how would you estimate the proportion of DNA within that area